Today we're going to take a look at some of the newer Campfire IEMs. So that doesn't include the older Orion and Jupiter and Dorado and Lyra, but it does include the Andromeda, which is also one of the older ones. But of course, the Andromeda is such a well-known benchmark flagship IEM that it kind of needs to be included in any IEM comparison and evaluation. Also not featured in this look is the Comet, the Atlas, and the Vega, but I actually have done a review of the Atlas and I've taken a look at the Vega as well, so you can check out those videos if you guys want to see my opinion on that, especially how they compare with the Andromeda. So on this side we have the Campfire Io, we have then the Polaris V2, then the Andromeda with the green here, and then the Campfire Solaris. The Andromeda is actually my own personal unit. The rest of these were provided by headphones.com for me to take a look at. And that wouldn't be totally fair to compare them all against each other because they come in at wildly different price points. The IO is an entry-level IEM, whereas the Solaris and Andromeda are both over the $1,000 mark and they're flagship IEMs. So it's really not even close to being fair, but they do sound so distinctly different from one another that there are good reasons to prefer the less expensive ones over the more expensive ones, depending on your listening preferences and genres that you're into. So before we launch into this, just a quick note about what everything comes with and the fit and build quality for all these. They all look fairly similar with this design, with the exception of the Solaris here. This is the only one that uses a really unique and slightly larger looking housing here. They all have a very similar style to them as far as how they look, just with different colors. They all do come with a carrying case of some description. I personally prefer the one that comes with the Andromeda, and I kind of like the one with the Solaris too, but this one's a little bit too large for me. These newer ones here, they seem to be the right size, but I find that the design and the style isn't quite as clean as what's going on with the older Andromeda, and some of you guys might prefer these. If you were to buy any of these apart from the Solaris, they all come with this newer cable, which is a big improvement on this is the older original Andromeda, which is this sort of stiffer material for the cable. And so I really like the way that this new one feels. It's actually very tangle free. For fit and comfort, I find that they are all actually really nice. I've never had a problem wearing any Campfire IEMs. They all fit very nicely in your ear, and you can use foam tips here if you're a little bit sensitive to the fit, and it doesn't dramatically change the sound. But I do find that for the best performance, the silicone tips are actually better. The one exception for the fit is the Solaris, which is a bigger IEM. And so it does fit a little bit more awkwardly. It almost sticks out of your ear a little bit more just because it is a larger size. But in general, I was able to get used to this as well. It was actually more difficult for me to wear a hat when I had this on compared to some of these other ones. But nonetheless, it did just fine. Now, if you look at the style of connector here, this is the MMCX connector, which is very, very common. One of two very widely used removable cable systems here. And so that does just fine, and it's nice that they are removable at this price. I think these days there's really no excuse for an IEM to not have a removable cable. They all should have removable cables, and thankfully they do. Now let's talk about the drivers going on in here, because for the most part they're all using some type of balanced armature system. However, for the Polaris V2, this is a hybrid system using two drivers. This is a balanced armature and a dynamic driver. For the Solaris, you also have a hybrid style system where you have a number of balanced armature drivers with also a dynamic driver handling the bass. For the Campfire Io, you have a dual balanced armature configuration going on here. And then for the Andromeda, you have, of course, the well-known 5 balanced armature and driver configuration. Now, my take on driver technology for IEMs is that balanced armature drivers are really popular because you can get really good performance for a fairly low cost as far as construction and manufacturing goes. But the downside to them is that they do have a bit of an odd timbre. The only way I can really describe this is sort of a metallic straining or smearing effect. Certain balanced armature driver IEMs have it really noticeable, while others it's not really a problem at all, and a lot of that has to do with the implementation. Now, because the Andromeda uses a 5 balanced armature configuration, you can just do a lot more with those drivers. So your ability in the frequency ranges where those drivers are specifically tuned for is just going to be better. And with the IO, that's extremely noticeable in the upper mid-range, so anywhere around 2k hertz, where there's a dramatic dip here, and it actually causes it looks like a U in the frequency response. It actually causes a little bit of a sharp edge to the frequency response before that. But the main problem is that where the crossover exists for the IO between those two balanced armatures, so the one driver that's handling the highs and then the one driver that's handling the lows and the mids, it really makes it difficult for this to properly produce those frequencies. And so you have a chunk there that's missing. Now, how that sounds is, it sounds like there's a little bit of hollowness to the music that you're listening to. The rest of the tonality here in the frequency response is actually really good. Your treble here is exceptionally good, and the bass is well extended, but it isn't really all that impactful, and that's again just a drawback of the balanced armature sound. The balanced armature timbre, which is again that sort of metallic straining or smearing effect, is worse or much more noticeable with the Campfire IO than it is with the Andromeda. The Andromeda does still have it, but if you're unsure what that even is, compare the IO to the Andromeda, and that will tell you. Listen to the IO, and that gives you a good sense of what that sounds like. So with the Campfire IO, this is a $300 IEM that performs quite well for its price. However, it has one major character flaw, and it's that dip in the mid-range where the drivers cross over, and it's just got that piece of information missing. But on the whole, for me, this tonality here, apart from that one major flaw, is actually really, really good. And in particular, the treble here is nothing short of exceptional. It does extension well, and it's well balanced. It's not sibilant, but it still has enough energy to be interesting. It's actually remarkably smooth, to the point where even if I compare it to the Andromeda, this actually sounds smoother than the treble to the Andromeda. Now, moving up to the Polaris V2, this is a $500 IEM that is a bass monster. And really, you can tell where the dynamic driver is being employed. It's that you get this massive thunderous bass that just is, in my opinion, too much. But it is also a little bit brought back because the highs are also quite present. So you have a dramatically V-shaped IEM that in some ways is that, guilty pleasure, fun sounding experience with, on the whole, much better bass response. And of course, the mid-range here is recessed, but it doesn't have that dramatic U dip going on that the crossover section of the IO has. So with the Polaris V2, it's a little bit more gradual. However, the overall frequency response does not lend itself all that well to music where clarity is important. In fact, it's just enormous, ridiculous bass and splashy treble. Now, while this is the IEM of their line that I'm the most critical of, I do have to admit that using this as a commuter IEM when you're on a bus or a train where you're in a less than ideal listening environment, it's actually not that bad. That's because for a lot of these other ones that are a little bit more neutral tuned, whatever ambient sound is around you happens to be in the frequencies that drown out some of the lower frequencies of the IEMs. And with the Polaris V2, that's just not the case. So you do still get all of the tones that you care about in the lower frequency ranges, even if you're on the bus or there's a somewhat muted drone there going on in the background. You can still hear your music very well with this. And actually, I found that while the treble here is less than ideal, it's a little bit splashy. Once I got used to it, I didn't mind it all that much for certain genres. And again, this is where I think the type of music that you listen to really matters. For more modern genres and popular music, I think this actually does reasonably well, and it is, again, that guilty pleasure fun sound. Another way of putting that, this is a baby Atlas. The Atlas does better, of course, and it's a lot more forgivable given its technical performance, but in my mind, that this is that same kind of tuning that I find actually a lot of Campfire audio IEMs tend to go for. Now, moving up to the Campfire Andromeda, as mentioned, this is the staple flagship that all other IEMs at around this price and even above are measured against, and it's for good reason. So this is a 5 balanced armature configuration, as mentioned, with exceptional resolution, clarity, detail retrieval, and overall an incredibly agreeable frequency response. It does really well with just about every genre, but depending on the output impedance of the source that you're using, it may be better suited for one genre versus another. So if you're using a source with an output impedance of over 2 ohms, 2.5 ohms, it's going to make the bass a lot less intense. You're going to have a lot less bass. Whereas if you're using a source that has less than 1 ohm output impedance, you're going to end up with a lot more bass. So if you're listening to modern genres, pop, rock, EDM, that kind of stuff, this might actually be a little bit more fun to listen to with a low output impedance source than a high output impedance source. Keep in mind that for all of these, they are also very sensitive, but with the Andromeda, that was the first time I noticed that, oh my god, I really need to pay attention to the source that I'm using because it was so picky. Now, moving on to the Campfire Solaris, this is a $1,500 flagship that uses a 3 balanced armature and single dynamic driver configuration. And again, they're using that dynamic driver to get that bass punch and impact, and it is used incredibly effectively here. When I was taking my notes first listening to this and trying it out, the first thing I wrote down was, oh my god, the bass, because it really does change the perspective of bass for IEMs and what's possible with bass for IEMs that aren't strictly planars. Overall, this is a relatively balanced IEM. However, the frequency response I find here isn't as agreeable as the Andromeda. So this one, again, it's more bassy than the Andromeda, but that also comes with added technical performance, detail retrieval, speed, intensity, almost like a slam quality to the bass, which is a lot of fun. And then when it moves into the mid-range, again, there's just a little bit of a dip, and it's not as dramatically V-shaped as the Polaris V2. However, I do still feel that the focus point for the Solaris is the bass. Now, thankfully, with the Solaris, you also get really good treble response. It's not sibilant, it's smooth, especially in the consonant range at around 8.5 kHz. This is a wonderful experience up top, and again, you do still get incredible detail retrieval up there as well. And the mid-range here, it's not withdrawn like it is with the Polaris V2. It's just not the highlight of this IEM. Now, overall, unsurprisingly, my favorites are the Solaris and the Andromeda. That should go as no surprise. They are also the most expensive. However, when comparing specific qualities of each of them, the outcomes are a little bit different. For the quality of the treble response, so not upper mid-range, the treble proper, my two picks, surprisingly, are the IO and the Solaris. Yes, the Andromeda is good there too. However, it's just not quite as smooth or refined as the other two are. So again, it's not that there's sibilance here, it's just that the overall treble response doesn't resolve the consonant range quite as well as both of those other two. And that again has more to do with the frequency response than detail retrieval or technical ability or anything else. Everything is sort of measured against the Andromeda, and so I feel like they just haven't been I feel like they haven't been, given as much praise as they deserve for the treble that they're able to produce. When the Andromeda came out initially, it was probably one of the better treble responses for the price point. And I think it still is. It's still really quite good, especially when you consider not just the detail or the speed or whatever, but the actual space and the overall airy quality that the Andromeda possesses. It does really do quite well. And actually, I think for that, it does do better than the IO. It's just that in the consonant range, the IO is a little bit smoother. And then, my pick overall for that is still the Solaris. For mids, it's actually going to be the Andromeda, even though there is an upper mid-range dip here with the Andromeda as well, slight. I find that it's a gradual, tasteful dip where it's not obscured. And that, again, if you compare the Andromeda with the IO, that is the biggest difference that you notice. That the frequency response here, the tonality for the Andromeda just gives you so much more presence in the mid-range. And the IO just can't do it. And it's very simple. 5 balanced armatures versus 2. you can tell that you got extra drivers here producing frequencies and frequency ranges that the IO just can't do it. It's too much is being asked of those two balanced armatures in here. With the Andromeda, it has the capacity in here to be able to do it just fine. For the bass, my pick is the Solaris and the Andromeda. Now, I like the Andromeda with a less than 1 ohm output impedance source, or around 1 ohm, that's fine. But I still find that the Solaris, because of that dynamic driver in the bass and the way that it's tuned, it's just a ton of fun, even though it is maybe a little bit much for my taste. And the Andromeda, I think, is a little bit more appropriate. The fun that this is able to give me and the intensity and the punch, it makes it stand out from all the other BA IEMs. But really, that's what it comes down to. If I'm going to spend an extra $400 to get the Solaris over the Andromeda, it's because of the bass response of this. And it's that much more fun. For overall detail retrieval, again, Solaris. For speed, again, Solaris. For soundstage and imaging, Andromeda. But the Solaris is not far behind. Because of that unevenness in the mid-range, it just feels a little bit congested at times. Whereas the Andromeda just feels kind of spacious and open, and I really like that quality. So if I had to rank the Campfire audio IEMs, including some of the other ones that aren't here that I have heard, so the Atlas and the Vega, I would rank them something like this. Solaris, Andromeda, Atlas, Vega, IO, Polaris. So really, in many ways, if you have a certain preference for a certain frequency response and tonality, you don't need to be spending the kind of crazy money to get the Solaris if you prefer the tonality that something like the Andromeda gets you. And in so many ways, the Andromeda is still, every time I go back to listening to this is my personal unit, I'm just reminded of how much better this is than the competition, especially the newer IEMs that are coming out that are using, 14 drivers or whatever. It really just is that much better than everything else there. And it's between the Andromeda and the Solaris, there are reasons to prefer one and there are reasons to prefer the other, and I don't think it's a clear-cut winner between the two. But because of that fun quality for me, I think I would spend more time listening to the Solaris than the Andromeda. So in my opinion, there is not a linear relationship between the price of these IEMs and their performance. So much of it has to do with your preference, and in many ways, you can get away with something that you'd enjoy more by spending less money, specifically comparing the Andromeda to the Solaris and the IO to the Polaris. I can see very good reasons to prefer the Andromeda over the Solaris and very good reasons to prefer the IO over the Polaris V2. And actually, personally, I do prefer the IO over the Polaris V2. Conversely, I can see really good reasons to prefer the Solaris over the Andromeda. And again, depending on the genres or what you're specifically looking for, if you want a bass cannon, maybe this is going to be better for you than the IO. But, personally, it's just no. Not for me, it's just not the case. Anyway, that does it for this look at some of these newer Campfire IEMs. So this is part 1, and next time we're going to take a look at how some of these compare against a number of other IEMs from different brands. And so maybe we're going to get to some conclusions on price and how these compare in their respective price brackets to other IEMs. Okay, thanks for taking the time to watch this, and I'll see you guys in the next one.